Okay, we are going to discuss in this module the first of the four modules of the System of Profound Knowledge of Dr. W. Edwards Deming, and that reflects or relates to appreciation of a system. Okay. Before I get to this particular slide, what exactly is a system? Most of us have some basic knowledge of a system and some expectation of what a system is. A system basically consists of a number of components or elements that are defined not by their own individual existence, because by themselves they don't really have any purpose, but they are really defined by the interrelationships that connect and that relate to each other. So, and there could be a variety of different systems. Perhaps the most incredible system that we tend to not pay enough attention to a lot of the times is the human body, where if you take a look at the individual parts of the human body, whether it is the heart, whether it is the brain, whether it is the stomach, whether it is the lungs, they individually do not have a separate existence. Each one of them has to work in concert with the rest of the system, and the kinds of things that we are able to accomplish with this kind of an incredible system is truly quite remarkable. Okay, and what Deming talks about in the first module is that you need to consider the system as a whole, because the normal practice that we find in industries and organizations is we tend to deal with systems by analyzing them. So we break the system down into its components and we treat each component as though it were an independent identity or an entity. Simplest example is if you take a look at the way in which organizations are organized or companies are organized into departments or organizational silos. So you have finance, you have engineering, you have manufacturing, you have marketing, etc., etc. Okay. Now each one of these really does not have a separate existence and should not have a separate existence, because ultimately each one of them serves a certain role in the overall company or the organization. However, from the standpoint of performance, from the standpoint of defining goals and objectives, each one of these silos behaves as though they are an independent entity. The end result of this is the fact that you have sub-optimization of the overall performance of the company or the organization, whereas the individual groups, the individual departments, the individual organizational silos try to maximize or optimize their specific individual performance. And that is where what Deming says is, unless you take a look at the system as a whole, you will have a very limited perspective of the situation, and that will cause the system not to be exhibiting optimum performance. Now, what you see on this slide is what was the method which actually gave rise to what we know today as the Deming cycle. This was what in fact Shewhart used to talk about, and this represented the way in which companies actually operated, where their task was, first, number one, the job they considered was one of designing a product or a service, depending on whether you are a manufacturing or a service oriented company. The second thing, once you have designed the product or the service, is you need to produce that, whether it's a product or the service. So it's a question of making it. Okay, so you design a particular product, you make it, and the third thing then was to try and sell it. The one thing that you notice about this is the fact that it consists of a linear flow, and there is nothing that comes after step number 3. It says once you sell it, okay, try to sell it and it's sold, that's the end of that. So the next time you design something else, that same 3-step process is continued. Now this is obviously an incomplete story, and Deming looked at this particular process, and the first thing that he came up with was that this required a little bit of further elaboration. So he defined the new way, and in this new way what he saw was that we have, rather than a linear movement, there should have been some kind of arrows here which I don't show, so maybe you should show some arrows indicating how these various steps are to be performed. And so if you see the new approach which Deming basically took and transformed it, so he took that linear process and converted that into a circular process, and there is a purpose behind converting it into a circular process, and that is the fact that you need to have a repetitive action in this particular method of designing and selling a product. So the first step in this, as you see on the side, is yes, you need to design the product, and that design requires appropriate tests, whether it be talking to the customer, getting inputs from the customer with regard to what they would like. In fact, one of the big things that was something that we take for granted today, but Deming was probably among the first people to really talk about the fact that the primary person in a manufacturing organization is the customer, and it is the role of an organization or a company to find what it is that the customer needs and then to find ways to satisfy the customer. It is something that we consider so basic today that we don't even think about it, but it's in those days where people used to produce products because they felt that they knew what needed to be produced, and which was probably acceptable at a time when the demand for products, manufactured products, was far greater than the manufacturing capacity. But Deming still had the foresight to understand that this would not last too long, that companies need to develop that ability to first determine the requirements from the customers, which is what he taught the Japanese, which is what I think caused companies like Toyota, Honda and the others to actually focus on the customer requirements, which has been one of the main reasons for the success of these companies. So step number 1 was to design the product. Step number 2 was to make it and test it in the production line and in the laboratory, depending on where that testing was required, to make sure that the product is as per the design. Number 3 was to put it on the market, which is, the first 3 steps seem to be somewhat similar to what we had in the old way, but they're not similar in the sense that we are talking about constantly testing as we are going through with it. Now, step number 4 was, after you put the product on the market, you then need to test it in service through market research, saying what the user who has purchased the product, what does he or she think about it, and for those people who did not purchase it, what are the reasons for those people to not purchase it? Because unless we are able to understand the feedback from the customer, we will not be able to understand how to improve the product and increase our basic market share. So then he added a 5th step, which is not expressed as a separate step, because that 5th step really becomes the first step of the next cycle. So what you see over here is that you have step number 4 is not the end point, because it is a part of a continuous circle, as it leads then to the next step number 1, which is the redesign of the product in light of the customer reactions to quality and price. So once you get the feedback from the customer, what they think in terms of the quality, what they think in terms of the price. You go back and you redesign the product to better meet the expectations of the customer. And you continue with this forever, literally, until the product, of course, is past its useful life, and there's a need to redesign an entirely new product at some point in time in the future. Now, Deming's chain reaction is something that he is very well known for. It's something, again, which is highly controversial, because most people in business tend to think differently. But Deming, if you look at it from a systems perspective, what he talks about as part of his chain reaction is something that you cannot argue with from a logic perspective. And companies that have tried to actually do things differently, and I'll give you some examples, have actually failed quite miserably. And we've seen disasters of this kind not too long back, when companies such as General Motors literally had to file for bankruptcy. They were firm believers in the opposite view. But before I get into that, let's first take a look at the Deming chain reaction and see what he was talking about here. He was talking about the fact that it is imperative for every company and organization to focus on quality. And the quality that he spoke about was quality in the broadest sense of the term. It is what the customer wants. Okay, it is not adding just more features. It could be taking away some features. So it could be improving the way in which we produce products. It could be eliminating defects on the shop floor rather than inspection. Because in the past, what used to happen prior to Deming coming on the scene was the idea of quality was to inspect the bad parts out at the end of the line. And Deming talked about building quality into the process itself, because he said if you build quality into the process, it would help improve the quality by reducing defects, which reduces cost, and reducing cost can cause you to reduce prices. So if you follow along this chain reaction by improving quality, and this quality is as produced, not as inspected and rejected. As a result of this improvement in quality, costs will decrease because you are producing less rework, you are making fewer mistakes, and there is obviously going to be less delay in the completion of your production, because products are passing through the process in a very smooth fashion. And there is better utilization of machine times and materials, because now you are not using machine capacity to produce defectives, which is a thorough waste of machine capacity and of people capacity, as well as materials, where if you've got materials that you produce defective out of and then you sell them for scrap metal, the actual devaluation of the material is quite significant. So you get better utilization of the machine as well as of the materials. As a result of all these cost reductions, you improve the productivity of the system as a whole. When the productivity of the system as a whole, your cost goes down and you are able to offer your product at a lower price. When you offer the product at a lower price, a better quality product at a lower price, and when again we are talking about quality, we are just not talking about conformance to specifications, we are talking about conformance to customer requirements. So if a customer can get what he or she wants or needs at a price that is below what other people are offering, quite obviously that particular organization is going to capture more greater percentage, a greater part of the market share. And when you are able to capture a larger part of the market share, that allows you to stay in business, because otherwise you have the run the risk of possibly getting out of business. And the last part, which is perhaps the most controversial, there's more than one place where this becomes controversial, but the last part is he says the purpose of a business is not just to make money. He said the purpose of a business, or the aim of a business, is to provide jobs and more jobs. And if you don't really understand this, you don't really understand business. Now, how does this make sense? Most of us tend to think that the purpose of a business is to maximize profits, to maximize the amount of money that a business makes. And the problem with that kind of thinking is that a number of companies, and we've seen this in the US, perhaps not so much in India at the moment, but in the US, what a lot of the manufacturing organizations, perhaps more famously the automotive manufacturers such as GM and Ford, when they realized that they were being uncompetitive, the normal approach that most companies have taken in the past to the problem of their being non-competitive is to lay off people. Okay, if your costs are too high, lay people off. If your costs are not matching with your profit desire, lay off people. Now, there are a whole lot of problems with laying people off, not the least of which is the fact that when all companies start to lay people off, where is the market for your product? Who are the people who are going to buy the product that you are manufacturing? If all companies start to lay people off because they feel that their costs are too high, you don't have people with money to buy the products that are going to be produced. That means then the company faces further problems. When they are facing further problems, they go through this process of further retrenching the workers. And what we saw happening with GM, and I've seen this personally in the 80s and the 90s, they went through various cycles of layoffs, but the financial performance of the company never improved. And the reason was because people were being laid off without necessarily improving the process, without necessarily looking at the waste in these systems, without necessarily looking at improving the quality. And therefore, when all of these problems came to a head in 2008, that is when we saw a giant of a company like a General Motors, which at one point in time was the largest capitalized company, not the largest capitalized, but I think the one with the largest revenue of all companies. It actually had to go through a bankruptcy proceeding. Okay, so the 2 points which a lot of times people find difficulty with Deming's chain reaction. One is the fact that if you are able to reduce cost, you should offer that saving in cost to the customers by lowering the prices, while not necessarily compromising on quality. A lot of times people are under the impression that the only way you can reduce cost is by compromising on quality. And what Deming basically says is that you actually reduce your cost when you improve the quality, when you actually talk about quality being getting rid of defects, getting rid of mistakes, and thereby utilizing your resources in a more effective fashion. So the improvement of quality leading to a reduction in cost, and the reduction in cost then being translated into lowering of the prices, and then lowering of the prices then leading to staying in the business, which helps us reach our final objective, which is to provide jobs and more jobs. Again, this is not an easy chart to swallow, because it defies a lot of conventional wisdom. which has not stood the test of time. There are a number of companies that have fallen by the wayside because they have believed in the short and quick make money type of thinking, which is unfortunately practiced in business, but it does not lead to the creation of long sustained success in the business environment. This is the there are two basic diagrams of Deming apart from the PDSA cycle, which are well known. One is the chain reaction that I shared with you, and the other one is this Deming flow diagram, which represents the production system as a system. And again, as I said, it seems very basic, but at the time when Deming came up with this was a big revelation, because the two things that he did here was, number one, he brought suppliers into the system, and number two, he brought the consumers into the system, because he said that unless you talk about suppliers and consumers, your system is not complete. Okay, so the Deming flow diagram actually starts with the consumers, and well, actually it starts over here with an initial generation of ideas, a design in terms of what needs to be made, with a degree of market research and so on, and you go through some sort of a design, and you then go through the process of production, assembly and inspection, okay, of the product after receipt of material from the various suppliers. After you have produced, assembled and inspected the parts, you then ship it to the customers, you sell it to the customers, and following that sale, you have a feedback mechanism to understand consumer reaction, how they found the quality and the price of what you had sold to them, and you use this customer feedback to design and redesign that material, which is then fed back. And in a sense, if you think about it, if you recall the cycle, not the old but the so-called new way of doing things, where we talked about design, produce, sell and then reflect, which, as we will see, was the precursor to the famous PDSA cycle. This is very similar to that PDSA cycle, or that earlier cycle of improvement. The only thing is that particular cycle ran clockwise, and the movement in this cycle is counterclockwise, as you see over here. But the beauty of this particular flow diagram is its simplicity, and at the same time it captures the key elements that a company ought to be focusing on if it needs to consider systemic understanding and to take decisions ensuring that a systems viewpoint is taken. This is a very interesting story to illustrate the thought process of a system. This is something which I happened to observe or see in a presentation made by Ian Bradbury in the fall 2013 Deming conference, and I hope Ian would not mind my borrowing the example which he had borrowed from someone else, but it's a very interesting example to illustrate the concept of a system and why it becomes necessary to ensure that we look at things in a systemic fashion. This apparently based on the presentation by Ian Bradbury. This is based on somebody's experience watching. No, this is based on a program, a TV program that was put out by Nature. Okay, Nature is a channel in the US, and it was about something that happened involving fishermen who wanted to go out there and fish for salmon. Okay, salmon is a very popular fish, food fish in the US, and elsewhere as well. So the fishermen wanted to hunt for or fish for salmon. Unfortunately, what they found was there were a number of sea otters, and the sea otters were eating some of the salmon. Okay, and the way in which the fishermen perceived the system was in a linear, non-systemic perspective. What they saw was that the sea otters were coming in between them and the salmon. So what they felt was that if they got rid of the sea otters, that would help increase their catch of the salmon, and so they went about killing sea otters. Now when they killed some of the sea otters, then for a period of time the yield of their fishing expeditions increased, and the number of salmon that they caught, okay, increased. But then after that initial increase, the catch, the number of salmon that they were catching began to wane, and it came back to some other level at which it again stabilized. Now the fishermen thought, well, the first time around we killed all these sea otters and that caused us to increase our catch, so let's go back and kill more sea otters. And they went back and killed some more sea otters, and again the yield increased for a while and then dropped back down again to some other level. They kept on doing this a few times until they had completely killed all the sea otters. Now what happened then is they found that the salmon yield increased, and then suddenly it dropped down until it was practically down to zero. The question was what had happened, and what had happened is, if you took a look at it from a systemic perspective, this was the systemic view of what was really happening, and the fishermen really did not have a clear view of the system as it was operating. Now the fishermen wanted the salmon as we see over here. Okay, so this is one part of it, and the sea otters were eating some of the salmon. However, what the fishermen didn't understand was that the salmon are actually quite fast, and it is not very easy for the sea otters to catch the salmon, so they were not able to catch a lot of salmon. And since they were not able to catch a lot of salmon, they went to sea urchins, which is another of the foods that sea otters eat, because sea urchins are not as fast, and so the sea otters tended to eat the sea urchins more than they ate salmon. They ate some salmon, but because salmon are fast, the sea otters ate more sea urchins. Now sea urchins, on the other hand, eat kelp. Kelp is sort of like the weeds that you see on the ocean beds, and this kelp in turn provides the breeding grounds for small fry. Okay, which the fry is a very small fish, and the fry uses the kelp as the breeding ground to grow. Fry in turn is something that the salmon eat. Okay, so now what happened when the fishermen killed all the sea otters? Okay, as a result, the sea otters were not eating any of the sea urchins, so the population of the sea urchins went up. When the population of the sea urchins went up, they ate more kelp, so that there was a scarcity of kelp. With less kelp around, the fry did not have any breeding ground to breed more fry. So the population of the fry started to go down. When the population of the fry started to go down, the salmon didn't have any food, and therefore the population of the salmon collapsed. So what you see between these two perspectives, one which was the linear non-systemic view, where we took a very limited view of the system as that I need to get to the salmon and we have the sea otters between us. So if you get rid of something in between, that should take care of the problem. If we don't understand the full system, which is what is seen over here, we actually take incorrect decisions. And this is something that we find happening all the time in businesses, in companies, in organizations, where companies take poor decisions, not because of any other reason, but because we have not understood a lot of the interrelationships. We have not understood the system in which we operate. And when we talk in terms of the Deming chain reaction, where we talk about people firing and laying off large numbers of people, what they didn't realize is the system in which we operate. When we lay off people, you do not really, you are actually laying off part of your market. And if you go back to the time when Henry Ford developed his mass production system using the moving conveyor, one of the smartest things that Henry Ford did is, number one, he brought the price of his cars down to half of what it used to be, because he could do that because of the productivity gains that he had got from his mass production system. At the same time, what he did was he doubled the salaries of his workers, and because he doubled his salaries, everybody else around had to double or at least increase their salaries. And by doing that, what Henry Ford was doing was actually creating a mass market for his mass production. Okay, and so it's something that people don't really give Henry Ford enough credit for, but he was a true systems thinker when you come down to it. Okay, this is the end of this particular module. We will come back and continue with the next module, which is the theory of knowledge.